Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. This is your host Aminah Ahmed, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. Welcome back to Next Gen, where we seek to amplify the voices of young people and focus on issues that young people are at the center of. Muslim Network TV streams on Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Galaxy 19 satellite. Today, here on Next Gen, we are discussing a topic that is timely and one that the world is looking at right now. The protest in Iran, the ongoing protest in Iran. 62 protests have been ongoing for 62 days. And just to give our audience some numbers, more than 16,000 people have been detained since the protest began. At least 372 people have been killed since the protest began. 493 students have been arrested, and 57 young people have been killed in the protest in Iran right now. 144 cities are participating, and these are ongoing protests. There doesn't look like there is an end to these protests in sight. So to discuss what is going on in Iran, what has started this, and what does the future look like in Iran, we have with us Asal Rezai. Asal is an immigrant who was born in Germany after her family fled Iran. She has over 7 years of experience in the news industry, where she's been a producer, an anchor, and reporter. A Columbia College J School graduate, she's worked in cities across the country covering breaking news, high-profile court trials, and natural disasters. Right now, she's a general assignment reporter at CBS News Chicago. Thank you so much, Asal, for being with us here today. Thank you for the work that you are doing for people in Iran. I feel that you are a voice here in Chicago for people that are protesting back where you are originally from. So thank you for being here with us, and thank you for the work that you are doing.
Yeah, Amina, thank you so much for having me on and for taking time and dedicating an entire segment and show to this very important topic.
Right. Also, I spoke just for 30 seconds about the numbers, and I think people genuinely don't know the magnitude of what is happening, the magnitude of these protests. But before we get into the protests, tell us about what actually incited these protests.
Yeah, I mean, so this actually started now. We are going into week 9 of these protests, which was sparked after the death of Mahsa Amini. She was a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was taken into custody on September 13th. And then 3 days later, she died. She was taken into custody by the morality police that they do have in Iran, that is under the Islamic State branch police. They put a press upon rules and laws that have to do with the mandatory hijab and other rules that are enforced under the Islamic State. So she was taken into custody. There's a video of her being taken and being put into a police van. She is then taken to what they call a re-education center that is run by the Islamic State, and there she passed out after being beaten for several hours. After she passed out, she went into a coma, and then she died in custody still of the Islamic State. Since her death, protests started pretty much as soon as we got word that she died. We do know that protests were sparked because of Mahsa's death and because of the mandatory hijab, but it has become way more of a widespread problem. This is not just about the mandatory hijab anymore. This has become really about women's rights and humanitarian rights in Iran. So now we are seeing a movement, a feminist uprising that has started for the last 9 weeks, as I mentioned, and Mahsa's death is what has sparked this. But for the very first time in Iran, we are seeing men that are joining women in these protests and standing up side by side, backing up women in these protests and these demands that they've been asking for. And as you mentioned, some of those numbers are jarring to hear. Since the beginning of this movement, if you think back now 9 weeks, 16,000 protesters in custody. A lot of those are students from universities that have been protesting as well, students there. All the children you're talking about, those are kids who are in the streets protesting alongside family members and sometimes just on their way to school or a store, and they're being caught in the crossfires of these protests. So that's so far, what we know, and those numbers that you read are just as of yesterday, and they're probably a lot more than what we are even reporting right now, Amina.
Right. And also, my question for you is that we have seen protests in the past decade in Iran, in 2009, in 2017, in 2019. What makes these protests so different from the protests in the past in Iran?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what makes it so different, I think, is the unity that we're seeing. You mentioned decades of protests that have been happening, and these protests have been happening, if you almost look at history, almost every 10 years since the revolution of 1979. And for people who aren't familiar with the history of Iran in 1979, there was a revolution where people overthrew the Shah, and Iran used to be a monarchy, and then the Islamic State came in, and we were run by a regime and spiritual leaders who have stepped in and ran the country. So what's different this time is all these decades that have passed and we've seen these protests. This is the first time that this is a protest, an uprising led by the women of Iran. And now we are seeing young people, very young people. We're talking about people as young as 9 years old to 20 years old. If we talk about the 370 people killed, I have an ongoing spreadsheet on my computer with all of those names. There is not one person that I've been able to find in those 370 people that is over the age of 35 years old. We are talking about the youth of this country that is standing up, and that is what we're seeing for the first time in these protests, is that there's young people, most of them, majority of them women, that are leading these protests and this uprising. That's what is setting this apart this time around.
Okay, and also, I think that what is going on in Iran is definitely revolutionary, and you're saying that it's so different than what has happened in the past. But why is it that people here in America, that people in Chicago, don't know much? Why is it that the media isn't covering this as much as it should be, especially when we see some of the human rights violations against protesters? Why is it that we don't know about this, and there is that gap with the media covering what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I've been able to kind of understand a little bit more, because it has been frustrating for myself as a journalist. I've had a lot of Iranian people here in Chicago ask me, Asal, why are you the only reporter at these protests? Why are the only person that I see consistently posting about this? And, you even mentioned that my Instagram, my social media has been a source for people. And I think the biggest thing is, as journalists, our biggest our biggest connection to a story is always going to be first fact checking and making sure what we're reporting is correct. And I think the issue with these protests, specifically out of Iran, is that there is no fact checking. You cannot fact checked the atrocities of a regime that is censoring people to begin with. All the information that is coming out of Iran is only put out from the Islamic State. Videos that you're seeing that I'm sharing, those are raw videos that are being sent from people on the ground that live inside Iran, civilians. The internet, Amina, has been shut down for 8 weeks. That's the first thing that the Islamic State did, was shut down the internet. So imagine not being able to post on Instagram, not being able to go on WhatsApp, Telegram, messaging, and they kind of debilitate people this way and make it so that there's no organization of protests and an uprising. And we've seen Elon Musk step in the last few weeks, and he sent in Starlink, and we are seeing more protests now because people are getting short spurts and access to internet. So I think that's the biggest thing right now, is you see CNN covering it, you see MSNBC, NBC, CBS. These are all major networks in America that are covering this on a very small scale. But I've seen Iranians compare this, to the situation in Ukraine. And what we have to realize is that Ukraine is a country that is being invaded. It is a country that is at war right now. And with Iran, it's not the same situation. We cannot compare this to other situations across the world. Really, this is a civil war, really, that is happening inside of Iran right now, where it is the people versus the government. And I think the biggest thing with the media right now is trying to get a grasp on, covering this and all the information that is coming out. How do you really report on things that are just raw videos? We are seeing people being shot dead in the street. I post these videos on my social media with a graphic warning to people and people who are watching and clicking through my stories to be advised that you are going to be triggered by some of the things that you do see. And I think the biggest thing that I've also been trying to educate people on is the fear that these protests may be Islamophobic, which they are not. The majority of people in Iran are Muslim. My mom is Muslim. My majority of my family is Muslim. This has nothing to do really with Islam. It is the fact that the regime and the Islamic State leaders are trying to kind of make religion the law of the land. And when we talk about some of these protesters, Amina, we are talking about protesters who have now been sentenced to death for protesting and speaking up against the regime, and their charges are corruption on earth. And they try to link this to Islam, whereas, a lot of people, even people who are conservatives and people inside of Iran who have long supported the regime, are kind of, starting to speak out against this, because it has become a situation where the Islamic State is trying to push down these laws that, now that other people across the world are getting light of it and understanding exactly what is happening, people are outraged. And I think that education is what's going to push this into the media. I mean, the more people know about what is happening, the more comfortable they are going to be talking about it. That's why 8 weeks has passed. And we're just now seeing people, celebrities post this on their pages, and people are more comfortable posting and talking about it and having these conversations once they're a little bit more educated and they know what's going on, right?
Right. Thank you so much, Asal. We will be right back after our short break. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Galaxy 19 satellite. We will be right back with Asal Rezai. Welcome back to Next Gen. We are here with Asal Rezai, a reporter at CBS, who is telling us about what is happening in Iran on the ground and the situation of protesters. Also, right before our break, you were telling us about these prisoners who have been sentenced to death. Tell us more about what is happening. I mean, clearly the regime is violating all sorts of human rights with this. So these protesters who have been imprisoned are now sentenced to death.
Yeah, that's correct. I believe it was last week or the week before, the members of the Iranian parliament, 277 members of the Iranian parliament out of 290, voted to apply the death penalty to the protesters that are in custody. Over 16,000, as we know, there might be a lot more, have been arrested since the beginning of these protests, now going into week 9. The protesters that are in custody, have no rights to any lawyers, and they are not able to contact their families. One of the most, I would say, one of the cases that has gone viral, Hossein Ronali is an activist and a blogger who was arrested about 2 months ago now, at the beginning of these uprisings. He has been in prison, in Evin prison in Tehran, where he has had no access to his family. His parents have sat outside of that prison, camping out, waiting to hear the condition of their son. He went on a hunger strike. He was then taken to a hospital in Iran, and that when he was taken to the hospital, the Islamic State forces, government forces, actually came and took him, kidnapped him from the hospital, and took him to an unknown location. And I'm saying this so that you understand and your viewers understand the power that the Islamic State has. A lot of the times we're seeing protesters who are killed and their bodies are kidnapped on the way to morgues, if you can even imagine that. And it is so that there's no due process, so that their bodies cannot have an official autopsy, so that the Islamic State cannot be you know, taking responsibility for these deaths and these murders that are happening. The 16,000 people that are in prisons, Aminah, they are facing the death penalty. A few days ago, there was a viral post going around from celebrities that were saying that all of these 16,000 people are sentenced to death. And then we saw some people starting to delete their posts because they believe that was false information. And I want to take a second to just talk on that, because what's important to note here is that, yes, 16,000 protesters have not yet been sentenced to death. At least 10 protesters have been sentenced to death and are going to be executed if there is not some sort of intervention. But all the rest of those 16,000 plus protesters, they are facing execution. They are going through what humanitarian organizations are calling sham trials, where they're going into the courtroom for about 30 seconds to maybe 3 minutes maximum and being handed down these sentences with no lawyer present, with no one there to defend them. They cannot defend themselves. And we have seen this in the past, where the Islamic State does hand down death sentences, death penalties. They will execute these protesters. And so what really people are asking for now is the international community to intervene in this and do something.
No, Asal, I think after hearing you, our viewers, myself included, we kind of understand what is happening in Iran, and just how harsh the situation is for protesters, for the international community who wants to step in, who wants to do something. What is your advice as someone who has been at the forefront of spreading information, of telling people what is going on? What can people do?
I think the biggest thing people can do is to continue to be the voice of Iranians. I mean, if you think about, our generation not being able to have access to internet, it is unfathomable, but that is what the Iranian youth are going through right now. So if you can share it on your platform so that people are more aware, the more we educate, the more people will talk about this. Recently, an Amnesty International petition was going around. It got over 1 million signatures. And after that, now we are seeing the UN is holding a special session, human rights special session this upcoming Thursday, actually in Geneva, where they are going to be discussing this situation specifically in Iran. And from that special session, we are hoping to see that there will be an official investigation, a committee of people that will be put on this investigation. Well, they will look at these videos that I've been posting, and look at the accounts of journalists and people on the ground and investigate this. So that is happening because of the outcry of the Iranian diaspora across the world. We have so many Iranians, not only in Chicago, across America, in so many different countries. You mentioned 144 plus cities across the globe have been protesting. We have seen insane numbers. Over 50,000 people protested in one single day in Toronto. We are talking about a community that is not going to stop protesting. And I've heard on the ground from protesters here in Chicago that have said, as long as protests continue in Iran and the people of Iran are on the streets, we will be out here on the streets protesting for them. So I think the biggest thing that people who want to help is to continue to have these conversations like we're having, and continue to post and continue to try to spread awareness that, this is about a regime that is committing horrific crimes against their own people. This is no longer just about the mandatory hijab. This is about human rights, about having the basic human rights that we have here. And Aminah, I would challenge people to go look at the things that are illegal for women to do in Iran. You cannot get a divorce. You cannot get custody of your child. You cannot walk in public with anybody who is not your father or your sibling. You cannot ride a bike. You cannot sing in public. These are basic things that I think people in America and Europe cannot even fathom being laws that you can go to prison for. So I think the more we talk about this and people understand what actually the situation is in Iran, the more the people in Iran's voices will be uplifted, and the more likely we are to see regime change.
Right. Thank you so much, Asal, for the work that you are doing. Thank you for being here and informing our audience, primarily young people, of what is going on in Iran. My message to our viewers is to please spread this information. Follow Asal on Instagram, and I usually say this, like as a joke at the end, like follow their Twitter and Instagram, but genuinely follow her Instagram. As someone who has followed Asal, I can tell you that I am seeing things on her Instagram, on her stories, on her social media that I don't see on other news platforms, that I don't see being covered. She is covering what is happening on the ground. Thank you, Asal. Seriously, thank you so much.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and your viewers.
And to our viewers, inshallah, we will be back next week with another episode on Next Gen. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, you're watching us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire TV. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all.